The senior attending physician looked at former Army medic Ezra Blackwood and said she was too young and too inexperienced to handle trauma cases in his emergency department. 3 hours later, when the hospital's power grid failed during the worst storm in decades, that same doctor would watch her perform battlefield medicine by candlelight while ventilators died around them. Ezra Blackwood, 28 years old, pulled on her scrubs at St. Mary's Hospital as the first drops of rain began hitting the emergency department windows. The October storm forecast had everyone on edge, but she moved with the quiet efficiency that marked her every action since. Returning from Afghanistan 2 years ago, her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, revealing the small scar near her left temple that she never talked about. The other nurses had grown accustomed to her presence, though Dr. Marcus Henley, the department chief, still watched her, with barely concealed skepticism. At first glance, Ezra looked like any other young nurse, average height, soft-spoken, with hands that seemed too delicate for emergency medicine. What they couldn't see was the steady pulse that never quickened, the eyes that automatically calculated triage priorities, and the muscle memory that could insert an IV in complete darkness. She checked her equipment bag one more time. A habit from her military days that civilian colleagues found excessive. Tonight, something told her she'd need every skill she'd ever learned. If you haven't already, please subscribe to hear more incredible stories of veterans whose quiet heroism changed everything when it mattered most. Ezra's path to medicine began in her grandmother's kitchen in rural Montana, where Nana Blackwood had taught her to suture by age 12. Her grandmother had been a battlefield nurse in Vietnam, and she'd raised Ezra after her parents died in a car accident when she was 8. Every summer evening, Nana would quiz her on anatomy using medical textbooks worn soft from decades of use. By 16, Ezra could set bones, treat shock, and perform emergency procedures that most paramedics never mastered. When she enlisted, at 18, her advanced individual training instructors were stunned by her natural ability. She spent 3 tours as a special operations combat medic, attached to units that operated in the most dangerous territories where traditional medical support couldn't reach. The defining moment came during her second deployment, when her unit was pinned down for 18 hours after an IED attack, left their medic KIA and 3 soldiers critically wounded. Ezra kept all 3 alive using improvised equipment and techniques her grandmother had taught her from the Vietnam era. One soldier later said she'd performed a blood transfusion using IV tubing and gravity while mortars exploded around them. Her core belief was simple: no one dies on your watch if you have the knowledge and will to save them. That conviction had brought her home with a chest full of medals she never displayed and a determination to serve in a different kind of battlefield. The conflict with Dr. Henley had been building for months. Despite her flawless record and additional certifications, he consistently assigned her to minor cases while giving complex trauma to less experienced staff. During their morning briefing, he'd made his position clear in front of the entire team. The doctor, with 20 years of civilian emergency medicine experience, believed that military medics lacked the sophisticated knowledge required for modern hospital care. He'd expressed concern about her tendency to work independently and her unconventional approaches to patient care. When Ezra suggested modifications to their trauma protocols based on battlefield experience, he dismissed her recommendations as inappropriate for civilian medicine. The breaking point came when she requested permission to cross-train with the cardiac surgery team. Dr. Henley had refused, stating that former military personnel often struggled with the precision required for delicate procedures. He'd told her privately that her experience treating blast wounds and gunshot injuries in field conditions had probably created bad habits that wouldn't translate to sterile hospital environments. His skepticism wasn't limited to her technical skills. He questioned whether someone who'd learned medicine in combat situations could handle the emotional requirements of civilian care. The irony wasn't lost on Ezra, who'd held dying 19-year-olds in her arms while incoming fire shattered the walls around them. The other staff had begun to mirror his attitude, excluding her from complex cases and assuming she'd need supervision for any procedure beyond basic triage. That evening, as the storm intensified, Ezra sat in the break room staring at a photo of her grandmother that she kept in her wallet. Nana, Blackwood's words echoed in her memory. Medicine isn't about proving yourself to others. It's about being ready when someone needs you most. The constant dismissal wore at her more than she liked to admit. She'd left the military because she wanted to save lives without the chaos of war, but civilian medicine came with its own battles. Every time Dr. Henley questioned her judgment or assigned her to minor cases, she felt the weight of her unused skills and knowledge. She thought about the soldiers she'd saved, the techniques she'd mastered, and the trust that had been placed in her by commanders who knew that, when everything went wrong, she'd find a way to keep people alive. Here, she felt like a perpetual student being tested on material she'd mastered years ago. The hardest part was the isolation. Her military brothers and sisters understood the burden of being responsible for lives, but here she was surrounded by competent professionals who saw her as an outsider trying to prove herself. She'd tried to fit in, to follow protocols exactly, to never challenge the established hierarchy, but it felt like performing medicine with her hands tied. She closed her eyes and made the same promise she'd made before every mission. Be ready. For whatever comes, the storm hit harder than predicted. By 9 p.m., St. Mary's had lost 2 backup generators, and the third was struggling. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows through the corridors as the rain hammered against windows with increasing violence. The emergency department had become a staging area for storm-related injuries, hypothermia cases, cardiac patients whose home oxygen had failed, and trauma victims from weather-related accidents. Dr. Henley was visibly stressed as the patient load increased and hospital systems began failing. When the main computer network went down, taking patient records and monitoring systems with it, he made the decision to transfer critical patients to other facilities. But the roads were flooding and ambulance services had been suspended. Then, the final generator failed. Emergency lighting flickered and died, leaving only battery-powered emergency exit signs and the pale glow of flashlights. The ventilators stopped humming. Heart monitors went silent. In the sudden quiet, Ezra could hear the rain and wind outside, and something else, the rapid breathing of patients who were no longer receiving mechanical ventilation support. Dr. Henley's voice cut through the darkness, tight with barely controlled panic, calling for manual ventilation equipment and backup power estimates. When the charge nurse reported that manual ventilators were limited and battery backup would last maybe 30 minutes, the weight of the situation settled over the department like a blanket. 5 critical patients needed immediate intervention, and conventional hospital protocols had just become irrelevant. Ezra moved without hesitation. In the darkness, her hands found the supply cabinet where she'd memorized the location of every piece of equipment during her first week. She grabbed suture kits, IV supplies, and manual airway management tools, while other staff fumbled with flashlights. Her voice cut through the chaos with calm authority that surprised everyone, including Dr. Henley. She began directing triage operations using techniques designed for mass casualty events, organizing available staff into teams based on skills rather than hospital hierarchy. When Dr. Henley started to object, she was already moving toward the most critical patient, an elderly man whose ventilator had been keeping him alive for 2 days. Working by the light of a single flashlight held by a nursing assistant, Ezra performed a manual tracheostomy using improvised sterile technique and tools meant for minor procedures. Her hands moved with surgical precision, creating an emergency airway while explaining each step to Dr. Henley, who found himself assisting rather than supervising. The next patient was a young mother in cardiac distress. With no monitoring equipment, Ezra used palpation and listening techniques to assess heart rhythm and blood pressure, then manually administered precise drug dosages calculated in her head. She taught 2 nurses how to perform manual chest compressions in rotation patterns that would maintain circulation for hours if necessary. For the next 4 hours, she moved between patients like a conductor, orchestrating survival. She turned IV bags into manual pressure devices, created monitoring systems using basic tools, and kept 5 people alive using techniques that predated electronic medicine by decades. When power was restored at dawn, Dr. Henley stood in the now bright emergency department, looking at 5 patients who were not only alive, but stable. The elderly man with the emergency tracheostomy was breathing normally. The cardiac patient was sitting up, asking for water. Every person who'd been critical when the power failed had survived the night. The transformation in Dr. Henley was immediate and complete. He approached Ezra as she finished documenting the night's procedures in handwritten notes, his face showing a mixture of gratitude and recognition that had been absent for months. He spoke quietly, acknowledging that he'd been wrong about her capabilities and asking if she'd be willing to lead training sessions on emergency procedures for the entire department. Within weeks, St. Mary's had implemented new protocols based on Ezra's recommendations. Her techniques for manual patient monitoring and improvised equipment use became standard training for all emergency staff. The hospital administration asked her to develop a disaster preparedness program that other facilities could adopt. The respect she'd earned that night extended beyond Dr. Henley. Nurses who'd previously treated her as an inexperienced outsider now sought her advice on complex cases. She became the unofficial mentor for new staff members, teaching them that the most sophisticated equipment in the world meant nothing without the fundamental skills to practice medicine with just your hands and your knowledge. The last patient she'd treated during the blackout, an 80-year-old man who'd been unconscious for most of the night, had awakened as the power came back on. When she checked on him that morning, he'd looked at her with clear eyes and smiled, the first expression of recognition his family had seen in days. That smile reminded her why she'd become a medic in the first place, not for recognition or respect, but for the moment when life wins over death and someone gets to go home to the people who love them.